Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 7th of November 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Scott, and of course, David reporting northern exposure from north of the border.
Well, we're going to follow up with a little more on what we were saying yesterday with respect to the election and defence. And thanks to Jackie for these two letters, one from Michael Gove and one from Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, on the UK's relationship with the EU with respect to defence after Brexit. And of course, the message on both of these letters is pretty much the same. Britain will retain its sovereignty. It has never signed up to an EU army, and so on, the usual rhetoric. But we just want to reinforce this because it's vitally important, and it's really important that this issue becomes an election issue. Now, just a quick reminder, here is the EU's diagram of what Defence Union represents. And on the left-hand side there, you can see that it says bilateral, multilateral cooperation amongst member states. And then in the middle pillars, we've got all the Defence Union acronyms like PESCO, CARD, CDP, EDF, and so on. And on the right-hand side are their core partnerships with NATO and the United Nations. Now, this is very important, particularly this one on the right-hand side, because if you read the letters from Ben Wallace and Michael Gove, of course, they highlight and stress that Britain's relationship as part of NATO is key. That is the fundamental pillar of Britain's defence. Okay, so this is the message that's coming out from individuals who write to the government and get a response. But of course, this is not being discussed during the elections. So here is one issue that we need to start pressing on, because here is the German Defence Minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. The delightful Annegret is saying this: Brexit or not, the island, that's Britain, won't just sail away. It remains part of our security architecture. I therefore propose that we make permanent the E3 format that emerged around the Iran question. Now, E3 was Britain, Germany, and France. And those three countries got together to issue any kind of diplomatic communique over Iran, and particularly with respect to the nuclear issue. It came out of the P5+1, and it was normally these communications came out as E3+3. But anyway, it's E3 is France, Germany, and the UK. And so this is all about a combined foreign policy. So Brexit or not, the UK won't just sail away. The UK remains part of our security architecture. That's absolutely clear. And if you want to know what her view of and what her policies are, the UK column has an article written by David Ellis, the policies of the new German Minister of Defence. Do go and have a look at that. Now, getting back to the Defence Union diagram then, the left-hand pillar is all about bilateral and multilateral agreements. And so what she is proposing is that the E3 becomes a formal foreign policy arrangement. That is one of the multilateral arrangements that we have in place. Now, of course, NATO is a key part of this, but NATO is a problem, particularly with respect to the UK, because the UK demands that NATO is the cornerstone of its defence. But President Macron was talking to The Economist magazine this morning, and well, he had this to say: we are currently experiencing the brain death of NATO. This is his position now. He's saying that he would argue that we should reassess the reality of what NATO is in the light of the commitment of the United States, and he's very concerned that Donald Trump is backing away from the EU. Now, of course, this is not the case at all. Donald Trump set his store out at the inauguration of NATO's new headquarters in Brussels in 2017, and his main focus was on the fact that the United States is paying for European defence. The US is paying massively more than EU countries are, and he was complaining that none of the EU countries were paying their 2% of GDP, which is the NATO commitment. He is saying that NATO only works if the guarantor of last resort functions as such. He's concerned that the United States is no longer that guarantor of last resort, and therefore he's saying that NATO stands, or Europe stands, sorry, on the edge of a precipice. That Europe is no longer in control of its own destiny. That it needs to regain military sovereignty, and of course, David, if I can bring you into the programme at this point, the UK is absolutely part of that, because the UK is one of the only countries that is currently spending 2% of GDP on defence in the European continent. Italy and Greece do the same, but their economies are relatively small, so that's a relatively small amount of money. The EU cannot pursue their defence goals without Britain.
This is absolutely correct. Britain is unique in many ways. It's a nuclear power. It's 40% of the military industrial complex of Europe. And of course, as we've seen on numerous little graphs produced by European think tanks, it's at the extreme end of willingness when it comes to engaging in actual boots on the ground conflict. Britain and France being viewed as the only countries who are actually willing to get properly engaged in places like, when it comes to the French, Mali. And Britain and France therefore equal the core of any European military unified army.
Absolutely. So getting back to the UK side of this, here is Baroness Goldie, the replacement for Earl Howe, of course, as Minister of State at the Ministry of Defence. And she claims that the withdrawal agreement and political declaration would not lock us into EU defence initiatives. But is that the case, David?
Well, I think just let's look at that statement very carefully. Right? The withdrawal agreement and political declaration would not lock us into EU defence initiatives. That's a very specific denial to a very general question about loss of sovereignty. You have to remember her background. Now, Annabel Goldie, somewhat beloved in Scotland because she did provide some opposition to the SNP when there was very little about. This is her biography here. So she was, well, she was, before she was in her current post, she was a whip in the House of Lords. So when we talk about whips suppressing the information about European Defence Union, that was probably Annabel. And she was leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland for quite a number of years. And before that, she had a very successful career as a partner, but building up to a partner in a Glasgow law firm. So she's legally trained and legally minded. And what I'm suggesting is that that's a very carefully legally worded letter. The next slide here announces, it's a Holyrood magazine announcing that Annabel is getting the job as Minister of State for Defence, and saying that she will work with newly appointed Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, and the responsibilities will cover efficiency and EU relations. So she's going to be all over the EU issue. And I would suggest with her legal training, she's not going to be like Ben, simply saying, oh, we'll need to get some lawyers in and find out what we're committed to. No, that she'll actually be on top of her brief. I would assume that's the case. So to look in more detail at the letter that was a quote from, this is the letter replying to a question raised on the loss of sovereignty and military union. She writes, thank you for your email dated 27 September 2019 on behalf of your constituent who has expressed concerns about the UK's sovereignty and our future security and defence relationships with the European Union, EU. I would like to reassure you, your constituent, that the UK will retain full sovereign control over its armed forces after leaving the EU. The UK will also continue to control the deployment of its armed forces and their assets. Any deal in future security partnership negotiated with the EU would reflect this position. The withdrawal agreement and political declaration would not undermine the UK's sovereignty or command or control over armed forces or lock us into EU defence initiatives. The UK has been consistently clear that EU defence policy and initiatives must be complementary to and respect the role of NATO, which will remain the cornerstone of the UK and its allies' collective defence. I hope this helps allay your constituents' concerns. very interesting letter. When she says we're not going to be locked into EU defence initiatives, well, remember EI2, which is a defence arrangement founded by a French initiative and involving European countries, is outside the EU. So we can have this, and that remains legally and precisely correct. So it doesn't mean we're not in very close working arrangements with the European countries. And when we talk about sovereignty, retaining sovereign control, you have to remember that European military unification is a layer above national sovereignty. So getting at the truth of that becomes very difficult. Now, the EI2 article, which we published a few days ago, it quotes the House of Commons Library, which defines what EI2 is. And it says the European Intervention Initiative. Apparently, the German translation is European Expeditionary Force, which is very interesting. It's a French-led initiative set out by President Macron in September 2017 as part of his vision for a sovereign, united and democratic Europe. So we're in this. We've signed up to this initiative for a sovereign, united and democratic Europe. And who signed up to it? Well, it was the predecessor of the Baroness. It was Earl Howe. Here's his signature on the dotted line. That's cut and pasted from the actual document put out by the. It was a letter of intent. That's all it was. But that's now got us in a 10, soon to be 11 nation alliance, cartel, yes, looking at foreign crimes to intervene in, looking at sharing defence information, sharing defence planning, sharing defence operations, and sharing intelligence. All of this based on a letter of intent, and a letter of intent signed by her predecessor. She must know about this. So when she's saying we're not involved in EU initiatives, well, okay, that is technically not an EU initiative, but it just has the same effect as one.
David, we can also say that if it's if the EU is sovereign and we've signed into it, we can no longer be sovereign. Because
this is the point, because sovereignty is not divisible.
Correct.
There must be one sovereign when it comes to the final analysis. Right? And this is the trick of the whole European program, is that countries have voluntarily signed up to a legal framework, which means that they, the sovereign parliaments, are subject to this external body, as are all of their citizens.
Right, and that's a key point. They've voluntarily done that. Now, if we listen to what Boris Johnson said, as we pointed out on the news yesterday in Parliament, and others have said, we will not be doing anything other than on a voluntary basis. And the other point is that EI2, you say that it was Macron's initiative, but Britain was one of the founders of it with Macron. So it's not like we've been sort of drawn into it or been fooled into getting involved in it. We have been key to its initiation.
Yes, or rather our government has, because it wasn't discussed in Parliament, it wasn't discussed with the people, and the implications haven't been examined anywhere other than in tightly controlled environments within Whitehall. Now, it was Freddie Howe that signed us up to that, and he wasn't arm twisted, he wasn't forced into signing. No, quite the reverse. He was very keen to sign. He was reported as being, he's quoted here, he was very keen to support President Macron in his initiative for a sovereign Europe. That's a bit of a surprise.
Well, indeed. So coming back to the original diagram then, the left-hand pillar of defence union is bilateral and multilateral agreements amongst member states. These are not EU agreements. These are agreements between member states. And so we now have potentially two, one that we're already definitely in, EI2, and the other one being E3, which fit that first pillar. And so they can claim that we are not signed up to Defence Union all they like, but it looks to me very much like we are. And we haven't had any specific response, as you say, as we highlighted in the two letters at the beginning of this segment and the letter that you have shown, David. These letters are very carefully crafted to make sure that they are dealing with very specific items and not the general question. And we have never had a proper response with respect to the general question. And this is not an election issue at this time, and it needs to be.
So we
yes,
can
and there are. Sorry, Nico.
So we can add to that of course, people who are writing to their MPs, particularly at this time, is putting the MPs under tremendous pressure. We're now into the run-up to an election. They are getting correspondence from constituents asking very powerful questions. This is putting them under huge pressure. And of course, every letter that comes back either demonstrates a template reply or else they've touched the tar baby. That MP is now going to be misleading or deceiving, or that could be out of sheer ignorance, of course, the general public, but they've touched the EU Defence Union tar baby and they are now dirtied by it. So what we'd like to say is as many people as possible need to get on this issue. We're trying to get out all the information to demonstrate that the British government is lying, has consistently lied to the public, because our armed forces are within this EU Defence Union structure. So get writing.
David.
Yes, and the nature of the beast is there's so many parts to it. They can find things they can deny. They can find either the wrong words, right? Because they'll go to EU army and say there's no EU army, and or they'll pick some specific thing like PESCO. We're not signed up to PESCO, although we're still contributing to many of the aspects of PESCO. We're not signed up, so they'll use specific denials and try and paint that as a general denial, or they'll ignore the big picture completely. The big picture that gives us away is what's actually happening on the ground to our military. That's the thing that put David Ellis onto this in the first place. The military and the industrial backing to the military has been taken apart. That turned him onto it. That's how we discovered this. And the reality is always going to conflict with their denials.
Absolutely. Okay, quick reminder, if you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community, where there are options for joining us there.
Indeed. We have to say a very sad announcement for UK Column, and that is that our very long-standing supporter, Carol Bragg, passed away early on Sunday, the 3rd of November. This, of course, was a great shock to her family, but also very much to us here in the UK Column. Carol was a grandmother who stood up to be counted. She did that fearlessly. She knew something was wrong in the country, and she decided it wasn't enough to ask somebody else to do it. She stood up to start to do something herself. And I think as a role model, what Carol Bragg achieved over 15 years working with us, nearly 1 million UK Column newspapers went out, tens of thousands of miles on the road for talks, assistants setting up events. This was really wonderful support from Carol. And I say today that here was this lady as a grandmother who could stand up and do this. Meanwhile, in UK today, we have senior military officers who seem frightened to come out of their golf clubs to get active. So we're going to miss Carol Bragg very, very much. And thank you to all the letters of support and emails that we've had to date. We will keep you posted with more details of Carol's funeral and tell you as much as we can. Where do we go from that? Well, of course, just right, we'll just bring this one back on screen. We've got the Charity Commission. I think I can best describe this as getting their knickers in a twist. What's been going on? Well, of course, we've suddenly got an election. Let's have a look. And somebody was kind enough to say, I'm involved with a charity and I've been sent an email by the Charity Commission We've never had one of these before, so we'll give you a little bit of the text, but it's from the Charity Commission. It says you've received this email because you're listed as a charity contact on the Charity Register for England and Wales. We're sending this issue of Charity Commission news to contacts only, and the UK column, thank you for that. Election special. Now that the election has been confirmed for the 12th of December 2019, we're issuing a reminder to all charities of their particular responsibilities in the weeks ahead. The Commission is aware that the political context for this election is very different from that which people may have experienced in the past, which makes it all the more important that trustees read our guidance on campaigning and political activity and the particular guidance that applies to during an election. We've also published lessons learned during the last election in 2017. It's legitimate and healthy for charities to speak up for the causes they serve, but appearing to take a political position on either side could risk undermining public confidence in charity as something special, an issue which our Chief Executive made clear in a recent blog. As well as your responsibilities under charity law, you need to be aware of the rules on what is called third-party campaigning under electoral law, which may affect your charity. The Electoral Commission has worked closely with charities to produce non-party campaigners where to start using real-life case studies. I'll just show the end of this. It is the real email. There we are. Kind regards, Charity Commission for England and Wales. So something special going on here, that the Charity Commission suddenly stung into saying to the charities, oh, you must behave yourself in this election because this one is special. Well, is it? We wonder. So who's the lady that's been talking? Well, here she is, Helen Stevenson. She's the Chief Executive. And this is a little bit of the same text, because essentially that email was compiled from what she'd said earlier. And notice the date, the 13th of September. So this lady's speaking well in advance of the announcement of an election, but she says, with expectations growing of a general election before the end of this year and all political parties preparing for it, I want to remind charities of their responsibilities and the guidance we publish. Charities have a proud record of engaging in public debate, giving a voice to their beneficiaries and highlighting their cause. I know that many charity leaders will see this as a critical moment to speak up for the cause they serve, and that is legitimate and healthy for our country. I want to assure you that we have no wish to narrow the space in which charities can engage. And I'll just give you the second bit. She goes on to say, I'm conscious, however, that the political context for this likely election is very different from that which people have experienced in the past. This is interesting, isn't it, that this is in September, back in September. So it says, opinion on the key issues around the UK's departure from the EU does not divide along party lines, and these issues will continue to feature prominently over the coming weeks. So she's certainly got to look into the crystal ball as to what's happening. And if you want to see what sort of guidance they're putting out, well, here's the front page of one of the key documents, Campaigning and Political Activity Guidance for Charities. And this is where it gets interesting, because there's quite a lot in this document, but I've just chosen this particular one in more detail. It says the key principle, although organisations that are established to pursue political purposes cannot be charities, political activity may be carried out by charities, but only as a means of supporting their charitable purposes. So I don't know whether I'm being a bit cynical here, Mike, but essentially you can't be a political charity unless your politics supports your charitable purposes in the first place. So if you write your charitable purposes in the right way, you can then be political and you don't have any problem with the rules. So let's have a look at this headline. This is BBC's charity, BBC Media Action. And Mike, you were just mentioning yesterday or a couple of days ago that, of course, BBC Media Action boasted that it was interfering to help destabilise Syria. And here they are now, leave no one behind, improving participation in the 2019 Nigerian elections.
Is that election interference?
Well, what the Charity Commission does say is that the constraints on you as a British charity are there whether you're operating in UK or overseas.
Okay.
But of course, if we look at what the BBC Media Action says, we support media and communication efforts that strengthen governance, improve people's health, increase their resilience, and improve humanitarian response. That's pretty broad, isn't it? But if we go down to the bottom of that, it says we work with institutions to develop policies, legislation and regulation that can support media organisations to work in the public interest. So I've summarised that as we act in politics to allow us to act politically.
Good.
You write your own rules. David, I've got a little bit more on this section, but I think what we're really starting to see now is participatory democracy. This is where the non-government organisations and the charities actually run politics rather than the Westminster that most people believe.
Yes, and isn't Helen Stevenson CBE's CV interesting? Because she's been 2 years, 5 months in charge of the Charity Commission for England and Wales. Before that, she worked for the government. She was the Director of Early Years and Childcare at the Department of Education for 5 years, 2 months. And before that, she had a sterling career in the Cabinet Office, where she was there for 7 years, 4 months. And she worked up to Director of Civil Society and Government Innovation Group, responsible for the Government Innovation Group is a section of the Cabinet Office dedicated to supporting social innovation, both in and outside of government, by mobilising people, resources, programmes and data.
David, I'm sure you're not suggesting that she's a placewoman of some form for the government, but let's have a look at the Electoral Commission. Of course, she relies very heavily on the Electoral Commission to give her advice. So the Electoral Commission, if our viewers and listeners don't know, is the independent body which oversees elections and regulates political finance in the UK. We work to promote public confidence. We're enabling the delivery of free and fair elections and referendums, focusing on the needs of electors and addressing the changing environment to ensure every vote remains secure and accessible. I get a warm, comfortable feeling here, particularly when I look at the chairman. Here he is, Sir John Holmes. So he's done a lot of things, because he was working in Downing Street as private secretary with Tony Blair, one of Britain's most upstanding prime ministers, I have to say. He's also been a British ambassador in Lisbon, and I did note that he's there in the Ditchley Foundation. Now, why would this be of interest? Well, I'm going to say to viewers and listeners, if you've never heard of the Ditchley Foundation, you need to. Here it is, a wonderful estate, and this is just to prove that here he is on the Ditchley board. And what does the Ditchley Foundation say about its purpose? Well, it says this: it addresses current challenges and aims to shape the future. We do this by connecting people and ideas. This enables new thinking, new connections, a new scope for action. But this is the key bit: positioned at the crossroads of government, business and technology, we work to, quote, renew and redefine how liberal democracies can lead and engage in an evolving world. I think what they're saying here is that they are rebuilding democracy, which must be a political objective, I would think, Mike. So if we just come in, we've got Sir John Holmes here. We've also got this gentleman as one of the other governors, Professor Sir Robert Worcester, chairman of the Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Commemoration Committee, but also founder of Maury. And I can't help but thinking that if you're gently stirring the political pot and changing society, you need to keep an eye on the vote. But also, I was very interesting to see that we've got our own Miss Jo Swinson in this organisation. And of course, she was very happy to have Guy Verhofstadt on her stage, saying that we didn't need nation states anymore. We were building an empire. And just before we move on, I had to do it with a little video clip. We won't spend long on it, but I'm going to encourage our viewers to go and have a look at the types of people we've got, because we've got big business, we've got bankers, we've got Chinese IT firms, we've got hedge funds, we've got political organisations, we've got the Times, we've got Savills, Bloomberg, on and on it goes. And you have to say, why are these people meeting? Well, they're not doing it for fun. I think they're doing exactly what it says on the tin, so to speak, that they're helping to rebuild a new society and political climate in UK. So a little bit worrying that we've got the chairman of the Electoral Commission sitting with that group of people. What do you think they might be up to, David?
I'm fascinated to know what they're up to. Everything about that organisation seems clouded in secrecy, but it's all very high level. These are the players who set policy, who meet there to discuss. Yeah, I'd like to know more.
Indeed, yeah.
Well, if charities are being warned about how they deal with the election, so is the media. Well, here is MRS and Impress. Now, Impress, of course, is the media regulator which came out following the Leveson inquiry. So they have pooled their resources to co-author some guidance using polls and survey data. This has been created to provide journalists with the tools they require to report on statistical data responsibly. So you've got to be responsible about how you report this election, because this election is different to all the others. So they've produced...
I'm sorry, Mike, the same message.
Absolutely the same message.
And we came at this from different angles this morning. There wasn't any direct collusion, but we got the same message. Somebody's worried about this election.
Well, it certainly seems like it. The message needs to be pretty tightly controlled, it seems. So they've produced some nice graphics and stuff there, but it doesn't end there, because it's not just this election that people are worried about. Apparently, it's the coming US election as well. So here's first draft. Together now, a global network for collaborative reporting and research. Nominate your newsroom to join Crosscheck now. So what's this all about? First draft pioneered collaborative reporting, apparently. Now you'll notice this is part of the Google News initiative, and it's all about making sure that disinformation is dealt with respect to the US election. But coming back to the UK election again, we'll be glad to know that here is the BBC. They are going to be managing their coverage of the election in a semi-automated way. So we're going to bring AI into the story here, because journalists are going to build story templates, apparently, which are designed to handle all possible situations and contingencies of the outcomes of various votes. And then they'll take the data from the election results, automatically process that data. Articles will be written automatically, which will get some minor editing from journalists, apparently. And then the BBC is also going to use a Twitter bot, which is going to be at BBC Election, to automatically tweet out results from every constituency. So their election coverage is going to take a step up this year, apparently, to make sure that it's absolutely first rate, because all these rules that are being imposed on journalists and how they cover the elections is going to end up being automated. David, it's incredible that journalists don't see that they're being put out of a job by this kind of thing, but perhaps the BBC thinks it's going to provide a better coverage of the election.
Yes, I'm not so sure that they will, though. The view that conventional journalism is the way forward is just not sustainable anymore. The internet has made it yesterday's technology. TV has passed now the way that radio did, the way that before that print media did. And it will be interesting to see who actually grasps the new media effectively for political purposes, because no one really has yet, although the Donald maybe got quite close. And we'll see if someone can actually grasp it, and whether it will retain its ability to be diverse and critical and to examine things in depth that it's had up until now, when there's maybe more political control directed towards it.
Mm.
At which point, I'd just like to bring us back to the Ditchley Foundation, because this is one of the gentlemen that caught my eye, Dr. Nick Gowing, who's here centre. And I looked at him and I thought, this is interesting. Director of Thinking the Unthinkable. And I thought we might think the unthinkable and have a look and see what that was. Well, here it is. We help global leaders to understand and manage disruption so that they thrive on change. To think the unthinkable demands courage and humility from leaders at a time of vulnerability. We help leaders transform themselves and their organizations by changing culture, mindset and behavior. So what this is saying is that the disruptions effectively been caused as a catalyst for change, and they are then cruising off the change in order to change culture, mindset and behavior. Well, that's the way it seems to me. So what do we know about this gentleman? Well, if we bring him up here, this is the CV that's actually on the website. It says he founded the Thinking the Unthinkable project in 2014. He's co-author of Thinking the Unthinkable 2018, director of Think Unthinkable Limited. He was the main news presenter for the BBC's international 24-hour news channel, BBC World News, 96 to 2014. And he presented The Hub with Nick Gowing, BBC World Debates. So this is a man embedded in the BBC, Mike, but this caught my eye in his CV. His peer-reviewed study at Oxford University, Skyful of Lies and Black Swans, predicted what is now labelled fake news. It identified the new vulnerability and brittleness of institutional power in the new all-pervasive public information space. He predicted fake news. That's just incredible,
amazing,
isn't it?
Yes.
Predicted. I wonder how he did that. But if we have a look at his colleague here, Chris Langdon, he's also interesting because, well, he's founder director of Reconciliation Through Film, a charity being established to develop new ways of using communication to help conflict resolution. That all sounds good. But if we pop down a bit, we've got an interesting little one here. He's worked extensively on facilitating political reform in Southeast Europe. He directed the Communicating Europe programme for the European Stability Initiative 2008 to 2010. And if we go down one more, this I thought was quite interesting. He directed 2 documentary videos designed to facilitate change, Bosnia Story and Mitrovica, if that's correct pronunciation, Chronicle of a Death Foretold. So we can see here that we're using media to change society, to change politics, to help European deep politics. This is, what do we describe this as, David? This is deep state at work. This is sociologists at work. What is going on?
I think they got a real shock in 2016 because we didn't vote the way we were programmed to vote. And neither did the Americans. And they realized they were losing control. And now, things like memes like Bill Clinton's a rapist, which someone shouted out during a Hillary Clinton presidential campaign meeting. Things like Epstein didn't kill himself. Right? These are showing occasionally on the mainstream media, but they're all over the internet. They have no power there at the moment. They realize that they have to get power and get it quickly. So I think what you're seeing is a huge mobilization of everything the deep state can throw at that little bit of liberty that has erupted on the internet.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's just leave you with this, because you might want to know what the European Stability Infrastructure is, and here's a definition and the birth. I was fascinated by this. The first meeting of ESI took place in June 1999 in the garden of a restaurant Lovak in Sarajevo. ESI's 8 founding members were a group of young people who'd worked in different organisations in and on the Balkans, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the World Bank, the United Nations Office of the High Representative, the European Commission, various European foreign ministries, and their motivation was to help international institutions understand their environment and become more effective in post-war Bosnia-Herzegovina, and to advance the integration of the Balkans into the European Union following the end of the Kosovo War. The founding members were soon joined by others. I had the picture here of a remarkable group of people. They're all very nice, as Tony Blair said. These are just young people. They fancied a glass of wine, Mike. They just happened to come from these different organisations. They didn't really know each other. So they had a pizza and a glass of wine, and they said, we're actually going to set out what the European Union strategic plan is. We're pretty straight sort of guys. But if you go into who's funding them, well, of course, George Soros is in the background, and it comes back to Wilton Park, which brings you back to the relationship with the Electoral Commission, but there's too much there. So something very strange happening.
Okay, we'll finish off with a little bit more on Grenfell Tower and a row that's sort of broken out over Ryden. Now, Ryden was the company that built or did the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, £10 million project. If you remember, it was completed in 2016, which included the cladding, which caused the problem. Well, really that headline on screen at the moment should have a question mark at the end, because Ryden had been named as being entitled to bid for government contracts, and in the light of the ongoing investigation in Grenfell Tower, the survivors were pretty upset about that. And so there has apparently been a reversal of the position, or has there? Because again, we got to sort of look at what exactly has been said. Robert Jenrick, who's the housing minister, said, "I understand why survivors and bereaved do not want to see public contracts awarded to the main contractor for the Grenfell Tower refurb until after we have the full results of the inquiry. The contractor should not bid for further work until we know the truth." Well, that is a tweet which says the contractor should not bid for further work until we know the truth, but there's no official government position on this as far as I know, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not entitled to bid for further work. He's just saying they shouldn't do it. David, this is more weasel words, it seems.
Yes, this is very strange, because this is what are we asking the contractor on his honour to sit out this contract, all contracts? You can't actually ask a contractor to do that. You put them out of business. In big contractor terms, government contracts are most of their business. So what are we accusing this company of? What are we asking them to do?
Well, now that's a very good question, because just let me interrupt there a little bit. That's a very good question, because the Cabinet Office have said quite clearly that it is not possible. It would not be lawful for the government to prevent anybody from tendering for contracts unless they have been actually charged with some kind of crime. So this can be nothing more than rhetoric from this man.
Yes, politically expedient rhetoric. That sounds like what it is. Yes.
Yes. Okay, now there was, just to finish off here, there was one thing from last Friday. We were covering Grenfell Tower a little bit. There was one addition you wanted to add. Just run us through this.
Yes, I want to talk a little bit about the gas installation. Now, this is part of the report which talks about the gas supply being cut off. So it says here, Chapter 31 describes the steps taken to isolate the tower from the main gas supply. The firm was Cadent Gas Limited, and they have a legal obligation to support the London Fire Brigade. They reported to the incident ground before 5 in the morning, actually quite a bit before 5 in the morning. And one of their key engineers, Jason Alday, who knew the area well but wasn't on duty, he arrived unprompted, and he took charge and stayed for 24 hours, shutting off all the gas to the tower. Ultimately involved capping 3 substantial pipes in nearby streets. The work was completed by 23:40, so that's about 24 hours after the fire started. And the remaining flames in the tower died down almost immediately. And in chapter 31, the last 2 comments in chapter 31 stated that when the gas was cut off at 23:40, Jason Alday described seeing flames in the tower die down almost immediately, demonstrating the contribution that gas had been making to the fires at that time. He remained on hand to supervise the permanent work on the pipe beneath Station Walk and eventually left at 7:15, having been on site for around 24 hours. There can be no doubt that the cadet team did an excellent job in finding the local gas mains, shutting off the supply of gas to the tower. They succeeded in completing a challenging task over a long period of time in difficult and sometimes dangerous conditions. This success was to a large extent due to Jason Alday's inspirational leadership, clarity of planning, and careful execution. So that's what the report said. Now, there's 2 aspects of this. The minor one is the actual closing off of the gas supply to the tower. The fire brigade didn't seem to really engage in this issue until 7 a.m. in the morning, right? So 6.5 hours after the fire started. So there was still a piped gas supply to the block. That seems late. The gas company had been on site for some 4 hours before, between 3 and 4 hours before the fire brigade engaged in this issue. And then it's interesting to know what had to be done then, because the shut-off valve is a metre or 2 from the face of the building. So all the falling debris made it impossible to get at that. So they had to go and find the gas mains out in the streets and cut off 3 mains, excavate down, find the gas mains, block them and cut them. So that's a long process. That's why it took until nearly midnight that night to actually finish it. But the other thing which hasn't been touched on so far is the design of the block putting all the gas into the basement. And originally there was a communal heating system and they piped hot water around all the flats. That was changed to one where there was a gas boiler in every flat and they piped gas to every flat and they piped it up through central stairwells, which is the only escape. And one thing I want to see the ongoing investigation, the part 2 addressing, is to what extent did that actually compromise the safety of the building, notwithstanding the cladding, and the cladding was the main problem. But that decision seems to fundamentally change the risks to the people inside that tower. And I want to find out whether that also was missed by our building regulation and planning system.
Yep, David, I'm astonished actually. Well, let's do the good news. The good news is that gentleman arrived on site unannounced and got on and did the job. He wasn't following health and safety guidance. He got on and took charge. And your point the other day was that we have individuals now in the fire service, perhaps also in the NHS, that they're so bound by the written paper rules they can't actually think and get on with the job. And that man did it. But fighting fires, you're either going to get rid of the fuel, or you're going to get rid of the air, or you're going to get rid of the source of heat. You're almost saying that the fire service didn't consider this early on. Is that true?
Well, it was it was about 3 o'clock in the morning that they called the gas company, and the gas company was there. The emergency response team was there within 30 minutes, and it was 3.5 hours later. And they were literally sitting around having reported to the London Fire Brigade on-site command, and they were essentially not needed. And it was at 7 a.m. when this employee of the gas company, on his own initiative, turned up and seemed to drive things forward, that there then was a bit of engagement in getting the gas supply shut off that there hadn't been up to that point. I find that surprising. I'm not in any way expert in firefighting and what the procedures are or should be, but I find that delay inexplicable.
Okay, thank you for that.
So that's us.
That's us finished. Well, there we are, David. Thank you very much for joining us. I think we're raising some very important facts and information with relation to this forthcoming election. EU Defence Union is critical because once UK's armed forces are gone, we don't exist as a country. And the other one is that it certainly seems that there's a lot of concern over this election and presumably the result it's going to produce. So if you're at home feeling, what can I do? What we suggest to you is get writing those letters and emails to your MPs, get the spotlight onto the MPs, ask them the difficult questions, and don't be put off by fob-off replies. Get stuck in and go back. And of course, being polite and reasonable at all times actually makes your approach more powerful.
I would say not just MPs, every candidate, and with respect to Defence Union, Brexit Party candidates specifically, because currently the candidates are the only people that we have seen making any mention of this. The Brexit Party leadership doesn't want any mention of this, so keep the pressure on Brexit Party candidates.
Yeah, that's it. And UK Column will be back again on Monday at 1 o'clock. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.